Welcome, everyone. I'd like to just, before we begin, acknowledge that Harvard Art Museums acknowledges that Harvard University is situated on the territory of the Massachusetts people. I'm Cassandra Albinson, Curator of European Art at the Harvard Art Museums, and I'll serve as the moderator today for the Q&A later on, and I'll also introduce our speaker in a moment. I just want to thank you for joining us in this new series called Art Talks Live. Art Talks Live offers an up-close look at works from our collection, and they're presented live via Zoom every other Thursday at 2 p.m. These short interactive talks reveal our latest discoveries and explore big ideas using the amazing collections of the Harvard Art Museums. And the format that we're in today in Zoom is one in which you as participants, your microphones are muted and your pictures are not visible, but you can submit questions in the Q&A box, which should appear at the bottom of your screen. The presentation today will be about 15 or 20 minutes long, and then we'll have around 10 minutes for questions. And what will happen during the question period is that I'll read some of the questions that have come in, and Elizabeth will answer them live, so you'll be able to see her and hear her. So she'll get to answer some of your questions that way. And we'll try to conclude at right around 2:30. And I'm pleased to introduce my dear colleague, Elizabeth Rudy. Elizabeth is the Carl A. Weyerhaeuser Associate Curator of Prints at the Harvard Art Museums, and she'll give us an up-close look at this French print from 1797. And Elizabeth is the foremost expert in the US on one of the artists of this print that we'll be hearing about today. So you're really in for a treat, and I hope you enjoy the presentation. And so with that, I'm going to hand it over to Elizabeth. I will disappear for a while, and then I'll see you all at the end of the presentation.
Thank you, Cassandra. Prints tell so many stories, from their technical makeup to the often numerous artists involved in their production, to their usage and circulation. Today, I'm going to tell just 5 stories through this print, which is housed in the collection of the Harvard Art Museums. The setting and character for each story are the same. The figures stand on the shore of an island off the eastern coast of Sicily. The Strait of Messina stretches behind them, and in the distance, below the full moon, lay the city and port of Messina. This map and contemporary photo of the area show the Strait of Messina separating Sicily and mainland Italy. Our protagonists are the consensual, star-crossed lovers, Phrosine on the right and Mélidore on the left. Story 1, the story within the story. This print is an illustration to a tragic poem of the same title, Phrosine and Mélidore, written by the French poet Pierre-Joseph Bernard. Bernard wrote his poem in 1772 and died 3 years later, so he never saw the illustration I will discuss today because it was made for an edition of his work that was published in 1797. The poem is based on the ancient Greek tale of Hero and Leander. It unfolds in 4 parts over roughly 40 pages, and it opens with Phrosine and Mélidore seeing each other across a crowded festival and falling immediately in love. Phrosine is described as a great beauty, so great in fact that her 2 brothers harbor ardent desires to profit from it. Her oldest brother Aymar wishes to marry Phrosine off to a wealthier man who would expand his own fortune and influence. And her other brother, Jules, consumed with an incestuous lust for her, doesn't want her to be with any man but him. These terrible brothers are violent too, and upon meeting Mélidore, a brutal confrontation erupts. Mélidore thinks he has killed Aymar and flees to an island where he assumes the identity of a penitent hermit who had offered him sanctuary. But when Mélidore arrives on the island, he finds the man dead. To remain undetected by Phrosine's brothers, Mélidore dons the cloak and practices of the hermit. In the most significant deviation from the poem, this illustration doesn't depict the lodgings of the hermit as a hovel, but rather as a built structure like a monastery. Thus, Mélidore adopts the role of a cloistered monk, which increases the charge of his unsanctioned love for Phrosine. A fisherman alerts Prozine to Mélidore's new location, and after a year of being held captive by her brothers, Prozine swims, unclothed, across the Strait of Messina, guided by the moon and a fire that burns on the island's shore. This illustration features the lovers' first reunion, where Mélidore embraces Prozine, who has passed out from the ardor of her journey. She is completely vulnerable in this depiction, unconscious, nude, and enveloped in Mélidore's arms and cloak. Without the context of the poem, she seems to be powerless, without agency. In the poem, however, she is the one with the most agency, the greatest strength and courage. She is the one who takes action to reverse the fate imposed upon her and her beloved. She is the heroine of this epic drama, and without her, there is no story at all. She is also the focal point of the illustration in every way. Mélidore's body is almost completely concealed. There is nothing to see but the bulky folds of his cloak. Prozine's body, on the other hand, engages with every piece of the environment. The crown of her head glows in the moonlight. Her legs, arms, and even fingertips reflect the light cast from the fire, and water passes through the toes of her foot, visible below the lapping waves. Upon her return to Messina, her brother Jules figures out what has transpired. The next time Prozine swims to rejoin Mélidore, Jules misdirects her with a beacon that leads her far off course. She is unable to correct her route and make it safely to Mélidore's island. She drowns, and her nude body washes up on shore. Distraught, overcome with grief, Mélidore carries her body to the hilltop, removes his cloak, ties his nude body to hers with a belt, and leaps into the sea to his death. Harvard's version of the illustration at the left is an earlier version of the print before it was prepared to be included in a book, like at the right. It bears the artist's signature, but does not yet have the text at the top and bottom to identify which moment in the poem is being illustrated. That potential for mystery is the subject of the second story today. Story 2, Dead or Alive? Swimming across the Strait of Messina was a considerable feat because of the currents, and it's an athletic challenge that is still undertaken today. Here is a map of one of the many routes followed by intrepid swimmers. Prozine makes this treacherous journey 3 times in the poem. It's really 5 laps if you count her return trips to Messina. As Mélidore waits for her, he is gripped with fear and panic that she won't make it. Gazing down from his hilltop, he first spies her swimming on the water's surface. He then rushes down to the shore, anxious that he will find her corpse washed up on the rocks. The tension between his worst imagination and his most hoped-for joy is one of extreme anticipation and suspense. And it is for that reason that the quote below the image in the final version of the illustration is significant. Specifically, the ellipses, or the ... dots, are meaningful. This was a typical thing to do for book illustration, to include some of the words of the text below the image, but not all. This selective quote asserts Prozine's life, removing any doubt about an alternative outcome. What an incredible scene! His Prozine was unconscious. But the fullest quote these lines draw from reads, "What a blow! Oh heavens, what an incredible scene! But his Prozine was unconscious." The omitted words, the ones that become the ... dots, do not change the overall meaning, but they do remove the moment of Mélidore's transition from horror to joy upon realizing his lover is alive and not dead. Just a few lines after the quote inscribed on the illustration, Mélidore scoops up the unconscious Prozine and covers her with 100 fiery kisses to revive her from extreme exhaustion. And that is what the artist shows us in this illustration. Without the inscription, however, it's not clear that Prozine is alive. Her body is completely limp, her head thrown back with her mouth fallen open. There is no definitive sign of life here. There is a later scene in the book that this illustration could also refer to, the tragic conclusion of the tale. The scene begins in a similar way. Mélidore sees Prozine's body on the water, rushes down the hill and scoops her up, but it is her lifeless body he holds in his arms this time. In eternal hope, he kisses her, hoping he will revive her once more. His frenzied mouth devoured still her precious remains. Without the text below, this image could well illustrate that heartbreaking final embrace of the lovers. The artist was certainly aware of which moment in the poem he was illustrating, and the final version of the print, the one bound in a book, bears the page number it is supposed to sit across from, the page with the same quote found below the image. But the ability of this image to speak so well to both moments in the poem, one joyful, one calamitous, is powerful in the experience of reading the book. Every time I arrive at those fateful lines at the end, like Mélidore, I don't want to believe it's true. The illustration from a few pages before still sticks in my mind, and I share his desperation, begging for Prozine to awaken, hoping that his warm embrace and kisses will revive her. This anguish, this suspense are exploited by the very print techniques employed to make this illustration, which is the topic of the next and third story. Story 3, Awash in Texture. There are numerous technical strategies being used in this print. Your eye always has new shapes and sizes of lines, dots, and marks to look at across the scene. An array of instruments were employed to combine etching and engraving, producing many different and distinctive patterns across the image. The lines made with these different tools have different depths, which means they hold varying amounts of ink. They thus create a beautiful rhythm of contrasting black and white in every section of the image. Two light sources illuminate the figures, the bright burning fire at the left and the cool moonlight streaming across the sky and water in the distant right. This dual illumination echoes the forces of propulsion in the story. Prozine is pushed toward Mélidore by her fear of her terrifying brothers and aided by the deities to whom she appealed. And she is pulled toward the island by her love for Mélidore and desire to escape captivity. The rendering of their skin, predominantly with dots called stippling, distinguishes the figures from the rest of the scene entirely. Their bodies have volume, tangibility, and softness. This is concentrated in Prozine's nude body, of course. But both figures' faces and hands are rendered in exactly the same way. Diagonal lines cover the stippling to indicate shadow. This print is engrossing as a technical marvel, but it is still a book illustration, meaning it is only about 8 inches high and 6 inches wide, and was destined for the confines of a book. Did anyone know about it in 1797, and how would they? That is the subject of our next story. Story 4, Marketed for Success. Some book illustrations never had an audience beyond the readers who consumed the books in which they appeared, but this one did. It was copied in paintings, drawings, and prints throughout the 19th century, and that is because of the marketing push behind it from the very start. I'm showing you 2 examples of later French works based on this illustration, a print from 1831 on the left and a painting from 1878 on the right. The reason these artists knew of the illustration is the publisher Pierre Didot, whose name is highlighted here on the title page. He published luxury books like this 1797 edition in which Prozine and Mélidore featured. And I must make this clear. The books he published were expensive objects of luxury marketed to wealthy customers who had libraries full of these kinds of collectibles. The scholar Sylvain Lavezière has noted that one of the main tactics Didot employed to sell this book was to allude in the preface to an opera that socialites in Paris had been talking about 3 years before. The libretto for the opera was based on Bernard's poem and was called Prozine and Mélidore, though unlike the poem, it had a happy ending. While the following selection is too brief to be representative of the entire score, I'm going to play the opening of the overture for you now. Didot's efforts, linking the illustration to a recent hit opera, making sure it was shown at the Salon, which was the major exhibition for contemporary art in Paris, ensured that this illustration would be seen by contemporaries as a masterpiece. And that is a moniker it still enjoys today. But is it the work of only one artist? That is the question explored in the 5th and final story today. Story 5, the answer everyone still wants to know. This exquisite tension between form and subject, where variable textures marry perfectly with the fluctuating emotions of the protagonists, was wholly ascribed to one artist when this print was made. A single signature appears etched below the image, asserting that the French artist, Pierre-Paul Prud'hon, conceived and executed it entirely. That is what was also inscribed on the title of the book and in the catalog produced for the Salon at which the drawing was exhibited. The earliest known version of the illustration, the first state, can tell us so much about the structure of the image and about the hand of the artist who made it. But this is still a considerably worked up first state, and so much of it begs even more questions. One aspect that's especially interesting is how the stippling is handled. In Phrosine's left leg, the hatching, or web of regularly crisscrossing lines, is already present in this early version. I've highlighted some of those lines in yellow here, as they might be a little hard to see on your computer screens. Scholars generally concur that Prud'hon's longtime collaborator and friend, the printmaker Barthélemy Roger, reworked the earlier version with additional engraving, that he used the burin to make new lines that firmed up or reinforced certain aspects of the composition, which was a common practice at the time. The addition of engraving is certainly present, and it is applied by an engraver adept at knowing which details to emphasize for which effect. But there are some problems with the conclusion that it was Roger who completed this work. 19th century biographers attributed the illustration to both Prud'hon and Roger. But at the end of his life, Roger compiled a list of every print he made or contributed to in his long career, and the 1797 Phrosine and Mélidore is conspicuously absent. Furthermore, the question of whether Roger's teacher, Jacques-Louis Copia, or the printmaker Etienne Besson could have added the engraving to Phrosine and Mélidore has yet to be fully explored. Both artists contributed illustrations to the same 1797 book, both working from Prud'hon's drawings. They did not work as extensively with Prud'hon over their careers as Roger did, but they did work with him on several illustration projects. Perhaps one of them contributed the final engraving to the Phrosine and Mélidore illustration as it was being prepared for publication. Years later, and because of the fame of the illustration, Roger made a smaller, very close copy of Prud'hon's print, which I show here. In the first state, it's clear that he built up the etching much differently than Prud'hon did in his version. Was this because Roger preferred to work differently, or because he wanted to distance himself even more from the so-called masterpiece by Prud'hon? This is yet another question to consider. Printmaking was a lifelong pursuit for Prud'hon. He made etchings early in his career and lithographs later, and I'm showing you one of each of those prints here. But nothing as elaborate or complex as the techniques in the Phrosine and Mélidore illustration has ever been identified as his work, except that one print. There is the possibility that the original accounts of his authorship of this print were exaggerations, part of a marketing ploy to bolster his painting career, which was just starting to take off. Or those original accounts were accurate, and Prud'hon's virtuosity as an etcher and engraver have yet to be better explained. Personally, I'd like to believe the artists and their contemporary accounts, but more evidence is warranted. Working through how Prud'hon's ability with etching might have evolved to this point is the critical missing piece. How his handling of the etching needle might have changed from his few known prints in the 1770s and 80s, such as the example on the left, to this firmer, more elegant work at the right. But this, I'm afraid, is a story for another day, as I have yet to embark on this exciting avenue of research. There are so many more stories that could be told through this print, and I've listed 5 more here. In the interest of time, I'll introduce just one. To return to the beginning, the setting. It's worth telling the story of what Messina meant to 18th century readers and viewers of the illustration I've discussed today. For centuries, the city had been a major site of international trade where goods of all kinds were exchanged, including the trafficking of enslaved people. About 15 years before Prud'hon made his illustration, the city was rocked by a devastating earthquake, which was reported internationally in texts and images. Messina was, therefore, a city that European readers knew from newspapers and contemporary accounts. Many would have profited from its commercial enterprise, and some may even have visited the city. How might considering this familiarity with Messina impact a reading of the illustration to Phrosine and Mélidore? Meaningful works of art keep provoking questions, sparking new stories, even centuries after they were made and first received. I hope you've enjoyed some of the tales I told through this print today, and I look forward to hearing what stories you may want to share or pursue through this or any other print. Thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth. That was fantastic. For those of you who are joining us on Zoom, you can submit questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. I just wanted to start, Elizabeth, just to kind of get things rolling with, I really like that list of the other stories that you were thinking about as you've been studying this print and pursuing this project. And I was wondering if you could tell us about what you call you call it on your list the bad brothers, but in your presentation you actually called them the terrible brothers, and they just seem actually really totally horrible. So if you could tell us a little bit more about that story. And I was really struck by these bad brothers that you describe, and then the hermit figure, who's a masculine figure who's so protective and sort of enveloping. So I'd love to hear a little bit more about that.
Sure, thanks. So for bad brothers, what I was referring to or thinking about was the metaphor of bad family members, but specifically the bad father, which was a highly charged, potent political metaphor during the French Revolution and after. The king had traditionally for centuries been referred to as a good father taking care of his children or the people. And one of the key arguments for the execution of King Louis XVI was that he was a bad father. He had abdicated his ethical responsibility for being a caregiver to the people under his control. And so I just wonder, this print made in 1797 fall on the heels of the most brutal and bloody phase of the French Revolution, if viewers would have been considering that as well, that these terrible brothers who have pushed these Phrosine into this other relationship, and then maybe this illustration is not just about the romantic love between two people, but really is the depiction of an ethical and just and caring relationship. So maybe there's another dimension to the story through its and to the image through that lens.
Okay, great, thank you for that. And that provides some really nice historical context as well. And just for me, looking at the print, like it's actually sort of amazing that he is such, the male figure is such an important figure, because that nude body is what captures you when you first look at this print, at least when I'm seeing it on the screen. So we have one question that came in asking how you became interested in this particular work, Elizabeth, and how long you've been researching it.
To date,
great question.
Yes. So many years ago, I wrote my dissertation on Pierre-Paul Prud'hon, specifically looking at the question of allegory. What he was famous as being, and is quoted in many different places in contemporary accounts as, quote, the painter of allegory. And I wanted to investigate why that was considered a good thing and what exactly that meant to viewers and patrons at that time. But as I was embarking on the dissertation, so I was looking at all of his work for that, through that question. My first chapter was on his etchings and then his book illustrations, and I spent an inordinate amount of time on that chapter, and realized that that I was just so seized with his engagement with print technology and the print market more generally. So it's something I thought about intensely many, many years ago, but have come back to again and again, because book illustration is really my favorite area of art history or art production. This intersection of image and text, and then you throw in all the artists and figures like publishers who are involved with the production. I find all of that extremely fascinating. So I guess my short answer is a long time.
A long time. Yeah, we could tell you
could. My imagination.
Yeah. So a question that follows on that a little bit in some ways is there's a question asking about if there are other prints directly related to his oil paintings, and sort of thinking about how his print process was it just for more mass distribution? I know you showed what is it, the beleaguered family, or the one painting that's related to that print, but are there others? And sort of how do you balance his interests as a painter versus a printmaker, and the importance of those two ways of working?
Yes, well, printmaking was the key to his success, and it's mostly thanks to Pierre Didot, the publisher, who This is all recounted in Sylvain Laviziere's exhibition catalog from the 1998 exhibition that was at the Louvre and at the Met. But they met each other. I can't recall the exact circumstances, but they met each other, and Didot saw potential in him and really started giving him these commissions for book illustrations. And even though he had been painting for quite some time before this, it was really he started to become so much better known through these illustrations that were shown in drawing format at the salon, and then through the patrons and etc. But his collaboration with Roger was intense, Barthélemy Roger, and in fact, they had planned to launch a business, a print publishing business themselves that didn't actually come to fruition, but they worked very, very closely, starting with illustrations like this one, well, not this one specifically, I think, but around the same time. And then till the end of Prud'hon's life on the reproductive prints after Prud'hon's painting. So that was very much on his mind. It just, that wasn't, at this moment, it was really about the fulfilling Didot's commissions.
Okay, thank you. We have a question, let me just find this one, sorry, from a colleague in the Division of European and American Art. What might have prompted the artist's shift to lithography, and what did it offer that he was missing in etching?
That's a great question. I'm not entirely sure, and this question really hasn't been answered. I feel as though with so often when the question of lithography comes up, the answer is, well, it was easier than other technologies because the drawing could be transferred directly to the lithostone, and the artist could actually draw directly on the graphic stone, and so that must have been the reason. I don't think that's a sufficient answer in the case of Prud'hon, someone who had delved so deeply into etching and engraving beforehand. So I'm not entirely sure yet, but I will say that I would say that he strove with working closely with Roger to bring his actual drawing technique as close to the marks of printmaking exactly at this time, and had a very specific and elaborate process of working up to a drawing that would be translated into etching and engraving. So his engagement with printmaking really it changed his approach to drawing, and I would think that there's something about lithography, that granular texture that you get from the crayon on the stone, that is immediately like his chalk drawings. I would think that would have been extremely exciting for him. Not that he couldn't still do this, complete his complicated procedure with the drawings for etching and engraving, but it's a little quicker. Right. Yes, but I'm not entirely certain. I think it requires further thought.
Okay, and was he pretty, it was a little bit later in his career that lithography was available, or, okay, so he was, as you were saying, like a very mature artist who was completely comfortable with those other techniques before.
Right, so lithography comes to France early on, around the turn of the 19th century, but Prud'hon was not experimenting with it at that time. He was still etching and engraving.
Okay. Yeah. Okay, I think we have time for one more question. Let me just see. Let's see. Sorry, I just want to find this last one. Okay, so this is a long one. It's a very interesting question though, so let me just try to kind of pack it down a little bit. So the questioner is saying, you drew out such an interesting parallel between the loss of agency of the heroine depicted in this print and the shift of agency that occurs between Prud'hon and the engravers and publishers. I'm wondering if you could say a little bit more about, or on the kind of shared vulnerability that both acts entail, which is really interesting. Does that make sense? I think it's a really interesting way to think about it.
That's great. If I'm understanding correctly, it's about the transition and the transfer of the design, right, to the next.
Yes, I think
that's
so.
Fascinating. That's just a very insightful question. I'm not entirely sure. I think, you know, one of the reasons that Prud'hon worked with Roger, and Roger, I should to say again, he was a student of Copia, who was one of the leading printmakers at the time, and Copia worked extensively with Prud'hon too on some revolution, political prints during the revolution. But I think he stuck with Roger because they, in a sense, they grew up together. That, you know, Prud'hon had tried to make his career in Paris and it didn't work out, and he's, you know, now he gets these commissions for book illustrations. So he's trying to make it again as a painter at a much older age than was typical for pursuing that. And Roger was the apprentice of Copia, and he still hadn't really struck out yet. He was still signing his prints, student of Copia, or if he would work on a print with Copia, both of their names would appear on it. So they were both at that critical moment of make or break it with their careers. And I think there's something there about the shared vulnerability and shared trust between two artists who were really at a pivotal moment.
Okay, great. Thank you, Elizabeth. You're always so thoughtful about artists working together. So that's very, I love hearing that, actually. And that's a really interesting read on that print. Okay, I think we should end. I want to thank you, Elizabeth, first for a fantastic and really thought-provoking presentation. And I look forward to seeing this print in person when we return to the museums. I want to thank you, everyone who's joining us by Zoom, for participating today. And we hope that you'll join us for our next Art Talk Live on September 10th. And the topic of that talk will be a Persian calligraphy album in the Harvard Art Museum's collection. Thank you very much.